I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism here at Birkbeck. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to what I think promises to be a fascinating discussion of David Glover's important and very recent book, Literature, Immigration and Diaspora in Fin de Siècle England, A Cultural History of the 1905 Aliens Act. As we gather here in the early 21st century, a century in which the staff of the UK Border Agency can be found on many mornings of the week, not only at UK borders, but at the Elephant and Castle, asking people for their identity papers. It's hard to imagine that in the 19th century, or for large parts of the 19th century, the borders of the UK were open to all. The 1905 Aliens Act was formative in the transformation from that world into the world that we have today. And David Glover, in his book, asks the question, how could that be? And he proposes that this was not only a political act, but it was also a cultural development, and that the Jewish minority were at the heart of this. He writes, the transformation of the alien and Jew into equivalent terms lay primarily in Victorian print culture. So it's really the sort of coming together of political history and cultural history that will be at the heart, I think, of much that we discuss this evening. David Glover will start by introducing his book. David is Professor of English at the University of Southampton. He'll be followed by Sonia Rose. Sonia has written widely on histories of gender, class, national identity, and empire. And also, I think one central theme in her work is where political history and cultural history come together. She is Emerita Professor of History, Sociology, and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan, and is, I'm proud to say, is an honorary research fellow in the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck. Last but not least, as children are taught to say in primary school, is Bill Schwartz, Professor of English at Queen Mary, though I persist in thinking of him as a historian, and is the author, most recently, of Memories of Empire, which recently won the Longman History Today Prize. And it's a truly magnificent book. So we have three marvellous speakers, and I'll stop talking.
David Hume famously wrote of his treatise of human nature that it fell dead bone from the press, and I'd rather suspected the same fate was going to befall mine. So I'm extraordinarily grateful to you all for coming along to this roundtable tonight. It is a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank David Feldman for his kind invitation to speak, and Sonia Rose and Bill Schwartz for generously agreeing to act as respondents. Literature, Immigration and Diaspora in Fin de Siècle England is, I hope, what its subtitle says it is, a cultural history of the 1905 Aliens Act. Do we need one? Isn't the Act itself sufficiently well known and well researched to make further investigation redundant? And in any case, isn't it time to draw a line under this particular piece of legislation and pass on to more pressing concerns? In fact, although by later standards the 1905 Act was relatively weak, it did initiate what became the long project of regulating movement across Britain's borders, whose effectiveness remains a staple of political debates today. Crucially, the 1905 Act broke with the laissez-faire approach that had been in place throughout the Victorian period and created a new regime in which the word immigrant became a legal concept, defined as an alien steerage passenger on a ship of a certain size, originally carrying at least 20 such passengers. And for the first time, a new public functionary was hastily brought into being, the immigration officer. We're so used to the immigration officer today that the idea that this is the point at which the immigration officer first appears is perhaps mildly scandalous. The immigration officer's job was to separate out those migrants who were likely to become a burden on the state, whether through ill health, indigence, criminality, and were thus patently undesirable, and arranged to send them back. Entry was permitted at only 14 ports, and each of these points of entry had a civic body to decide cases where an immigrant wished to appeal an officer's decision. These immigration boards were designed to both bring the law in and to keep it out. In other words, what they offered was a system of local justice, administered by local worthies, whose judgments were insulated from the wider legal process, since the board's decision was intended to be final. As elsewhere, organised attempts to bring under the rule of law what the then Conservative Home Secretary called the machinery at the port played a central role in legal struggles around the decisions licensed by the Act. These legal struggles were all the more noteworthy because the Act was implemented by a Liberal government, not brought in by, but implemented by a Liberal government, whose ministers were some of the very same men who had opposed the Aliens Bill as it went through Parliament. The vicissitudes of implementation have received a lot less attention than they deserve. If one takes a long view of the 1905 Act, taking in not only the anti-alien campaigns that date back to the early 1890s, but also following the political circumstances leading up to its temporary replacement, temporary in inverted commas there, by the Wartime Aliens Restrictions Act in 1914, then I think the Aliens Act can be seen as a bigger event than has usually been recognised, covering a period of nearly a quarter of a century. It's also a bigger event because of its reverberations across the whole culture, stitching together the three major overlapping zones of controversy, variously known as the aliens question, the Jewish question, and the social question. I call them zones of controversy because their very existence was sometimes deeply contested. It was perfectly possible to insist, as the Tory Prime Minister Arthur Balfour did, that there was no Jewish question in Britain, only an alien question. Like the undesirable immigrant, him or herself, the Jewish question was an unwanted intrusion from foreign shores, and the sooner it was deported, the better. In attempting to get to grips with these cultural reverberations, I've been unavoidably concerned with the study of narrative in the broadest sense. That's to say, I tried to follow the stories that the major agents and forces in the turbulence around immigration control drew upon in characterising their projects, or that captured their individual and collective imaginations, tracing their variants and transformations, their reconstruction and revisions. Sometimes this pursuit is focused on the history of a specific concept, how, for example, the term anti-Semitism was first introduced into Britain, and the disputes around its meaning and application. Sometimes I focused upon the extraordinarily rich resonance produced by particular works of fiction. Here, George Eliot's Daniel Deronda is a key text, a novel that was endlessly rewritten or reimagined in the years after the author's death in 1880. If I can adapt a useful formulation from Professor Josephine MacDonough's recent inaugural lecture at King's, narratives are the sites where we try out new ideas or try them on. I am Daniel Deronda, Colonel Albert Edward Goldschmidt told Theodore Herzl at their meeting in Cardiff in 1895. This encounter is one of the ways in which Herzl's Zionism, surely one of the grand narratives of the period, was interrogated or mediated, but also aligned with Englishness, as Herzl's own Anglophilia might lead one to expect. Yet while Eliot's novel, abridged, partially translated, circulating in serial form, could be read as an imaginative supplement to the Zionist project, it was sometimes read against it and, in some of the most mischievous reworkings of the text, was turned into a vehicle of anti-Semitic abuse. Indeed, the splitting of the novel displacing or excising what was felt to be its Jewish element, has been an almost permanent feature of literary criticism since Henry James first published his dialogue on Daniel Deronda in 1876. Nevertheless, part of the interest of Eliot's novel stems from the complex relationship that it establishes between Englishness and Jewishness, in which Daniel is the epitome of the cultured English gentleman, though his place of birth and national identity are obscure, while Mordecai is an English subject. At the end of the novel, Daniel is about to leave for the East, while the model of the Jewish state as a neutral ground that Mordecai propounds is based, surprisingly, upon the newly proclaimed European nation of Belgium. In a sense, one could see this blueprint as one of two visions of a new Jewish policy that were in play during Herzl's lifetime. The neutral state that, like Belgium, was sheltered by the great powers, the other being the colonial enclave, a model which takes us into the discussions between Herzl and Joseph Chamberlain, and the story of what became known as the Uganda Offer, or the East African Scheme. In his evidence to the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration that preceded the first appearance of the Aliens Bill in 1904, Herzl argued that if the Jews were to gain a home of their own, there would be no need for a very un-English law that prevented free movement into Britain. The movement to bring in an Aliens Act is very much an East End story, not simply because the East End of London was the largest area of Jewish settlement, but because of the widespread view that it represented a test case for addressing the kinds of social problems that were believed to be endemic to the new industrial city. Among the schemes to introduce a measure of cultural uplift to the East End was the idea for a new recreational centre in the heart of Mile End called the Palace of Delight, or the Club of Working People, in Walter Besant's best-selling novel All Sorts and Conditions of Men from 1882, but finally named the People's Palace, something that Bill will know very well coming from Queen Mary, and opened by the Queen in 1887, thereby giving the lie to Besant's own subtitle, An Impossible Story. That's what he thought All Conditions of Men, and the idea of a Palace of Delight was an impossible story. It couldn't happen. Of course, the plan for a People's Palace predated Besant's novel, but there's no question that the success of his book played a crucial role in publicising the venture and helped to make it a reality. I want to make two quick points about Besant's diagnosis of the sorrows of East London. First of all, the source of the problem lay not only in the fact that work was badly and exploitatively organised, so the novel includes a hopeful sketch of a dressmakers' cooperative, for instance, but also in the way in which the frenzied pace of labour squeezes out any possibility of meaningful and improving leisure, and the Palace of Delights, the People's Palace, was designed to bring that in. Revealingly, Besant tries to capture this condition by alluding to a canvas you find in the Guildhall depicting the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt, Sir Edward Poynter's Israel in Egypt from 1867. This image helps to bring out the second noticeable feature of Besant's account of the East End. It lacks any awareness of the ethnic mix of the area or its traditions of settlement. For a contrast, one has to go to a different kind of writing, usually associated with the slum fiction of the 1880s and 1890s. The popular word slumdom seems to have been coined in the same year that All Sorts and Conditions of Men was published, ironically enough. The novels written by Eleanor Marx and Friedrich Engels, sometime from Margaret Harkness, are worth revisiting precisely because they survey the same terrain as Besant, but do so in a bleak and at times combative vein. Harkness would use subtitles like A Realistic Story or A Realistic Story of Today, and I'd argue that this isn't merely a way of nailing her colours to Emile Zola's Masthead. It's also designed to mark a distinction between her own politics and those of Besant. In case we missed the point, in her 1888 novel, Out of Work, Harkness describes the press as inventing stories of the rapturous reception given to Queen Victoria when she visits the East End, obscuring the fact that, quote, the crowd about the Palace of Delight had had a sullen, ugly look, which may a year or so hence prove dangerous. Racial politics aren't exactly Harkness's strongest suit either, but I think there are two sides to her writing. On the one hand, there are the phantasmatic and vengeful depictions of the Jewish sweatshop owner, in books like The Manchester Shirtmaker, which actually isn't really a book about Manchester at all. I can say maybe a bit more about that in questions if you like. While on the other, her portrayal of the East End in her book In Darkest London indicates an ethnic mix in which the term foreigner is a shifting target, as readily applied to the royal family as to Jewish women. I wouldn't say that this stance betrays a kind of ambivalence, but in the best of Harkness's very uneven work, there is a plethora of contending voices in which one begins to grasp the uses to which anti-Semitism is being put, rather than taking it as a position which one is invited to occupy. But to bring that out fully, one would have to read In Darkest London in tandem with Israel Zangwill's Children of the Ghetto. Harkness failed to turn The People's Palace into an object-lessening class collaboration, but on the 18th of January 1902, a different kind of cross-class politics made itself heard in in People's Palace, when the British Brothers League held its great public demonstration against alien immigration. This was the biggest of the anti-alien organisations, but proved to be relatively short-lived. And although it's tempting to see it as a proto-fascist movement, the MPs who associated themselves with it, notably Major William Evans Gordon, were careful to make sure that they were speaking independently and were not enthralled to this constituency. At the same time, they never hesitated to conjure up the spectre of racist discontent. The pattern displayed by the BBL was one of incitement and disavowal, and something similar was true of the wider society. At the People's Palace meeting, Arnold White, probably at that time the figure in British life nearest in outlook to Edouard Drummond, was able to raise cries of "wipe them out" from the gallery, without ever naming the object of his tirade. But when the BBL's founder, William Stanley Shaw, who'd already left the organisation on the grounds of its anti-Semitism, attempted to capitalise on the ferocious attack and boycott on Jews in Limerick in 1904, drawing explicit parallels with alleged Jewish boycotting of small British shopkeepers, in a letter that in the East End, in a letter that he sent to the Daily Express, that newspaper refused to print it. In response, Shaw had it printed up as a poster with the slogan, "The only real solution of the Jewish problem is the Zion movement." Small wonder that Israel Zangwill was later to describe English anti-Semitism as an indefinite thing, declining to sponsor a demonstration against it. "You might as well protest against the fog and the rain," he wrote in a letter. And the only problem, I think, with ending on this note is that by this time, Zangwill's writing in 1907, the radical right were thoroughly disillusioned with the Aliens Act too.
The cultural history of the 1905 Aliens Act is a positively wonderful book. I found it to be thoroughly engaging and intellectually stimulating from start to finish. David's exploration of the cultural productions leading up to, surrounding, and then in the aftermath of the 1905 Aliens Act reveals a complexity to changes in the political and legal culture that I would not have guessed at before. Thinking about the current conjuncture today, as well as the post-World War II era with their fears and reactions to the migration of different others into Britain, David's examination of the cultural commentary in response to in-migration of Jews /anarchists/aliens /immigrants at the turn of the century sounds all too familiar as these terms become increasingly blurred and turn into synecdoches, synonyms sort of, much as the terms Islamist, terrorist, or even Muslim have become today. It is also clear from what we know of the histories of immigration and citizenship reform that the progressive strengthening of the borders against others that the Aliens Act of 1905 absolutely must be seen as a turning point in British political and cultural history, as both Davids have already suggested. What I found most compelling about David Glover's analysis was his emphasis on complexity and contradiction. I think some of that came through in what he just said. His is not a simple story of the inevitable building of a hegemonic, pro-restriction, anti-alien, anti-Semitic political culture, but rather of the fractures and tensions within a society that above all had prided itself on tolerance and a history of granting asylum and welcoming refugees. It is a story illustrating not simply the growing dominance of an anti-liberal, right-wing political culture. Rather, it is a story of a fractured, very fractured structure of feeling, one that, in the end, produced a very complex, multi-layered, hegemonic, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-alien ideology. In part, it is a story of the many different, contradictory, and competing strands of anti-Jewish, anti-alien political sentiment, from socialist to liberal to conservative to the radical right. But it's also a story of writers and others who seemed to want to preserve Britain as some sort of liberal utopia. It is perhaps a story that, in part, that illustrates the tensions and contradictions within liberalism itself. Early on, as I read, I wondered what it was that David meant by the term liberal. I mean, sometimes it obviously was referring to the Liberal Party, but other times the term was used. Clearly, the term is ambiguous, but as he suggests at one point, quote, liberal modernity assumed a form of life in which the state was constantly engaged in determining the limits and the risks that free and active subjects must face, close quote. Also, as David implies throughout his book, liberalism was closely associated with cosmopolitanism. As Uday Mehta has noted, quote, liberalism has come to represent political thought that was cosmopolitan in its imagination and potential reach. It was meant as universal in its applicability. The universal claims of liberalism, Mehta argues, are based on what he calls an anthropological minimum or common denominator that underpins what it means to be a human. One capable of both acting rationally and being trusted with individual rights and freedoms. This has meant that liberalism has always had problems with difference. Perhaps this is why the idea of British tolerance was so important and was seen to be under threat. Under threat not only by exclusionary laws, but also by those who, because of their difference, their otherness, threatened that tolerance, stimulated intolerance. David suggests in my reading of his work that there was a desire on the part of all players, political and cultural, except perhaps for the radical right, to preserve the idea of British tolerance. Intolerance generally and anti-Semitism in particular were said to be over there, in France, in Germany, in Russia. One of the arguments for curtailing alien immigration was, David's work implies, that unrestricted immigration would create intolerance and anti-Semitism in Britain. Interestingly, this argument has had a long life. A similar argument was voiced during World War II when the British public were told about the Nazi extermination camps and there were calls to accept Jewish refugees into the country. Then, too, there was an outpouring of anti-Semitic sentiment in response to those calls, and an expressed fear on the part of some government officials that letting refugees into the country would only make anti-Semitism grow. When government officials were pressed to address the problem of anti-Semitism with radio broadcasts and through other media, they declined, fearing that drawing attention to anti-Semitism would stimulate it. In the 1880s and 1890s, as David argues, while anti-Semitism was both contested and pervasive, quote, it was frequently regarded by the political class as a volatile problem that needed to be managed, as a danger that was symptomatic of democratic or popular excess, close quote. The intolerance of anti-Semitism then was either over there on the continent or was being promulgated by a minority of unrespectable loudmouths, but was certainly not truly English. In the debates on the Aliens Bill, David argues further that those in favor of restricting alien immigration were in an uncomfortable position. If they denied the relevance of Jewishness to the necessity for immigration control, then the argument, about which I'll have more to say later, decrying the erosion of English culture in cities would not work. Or they could insist that Jews were degrading Britain and risk being called anti-Semites. Therefore, an aliens bill was the only way to prevent the rise of anti-Semitism. It is interesting that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were conflicting negative representations of the Jew. As David points out, the long-lived view of the Jew as moneylender was refurbished, and Jews became sweaters, money grubbers, and wealth-seeking capitalists or plutocrats. The latter idea was favored by left-wing socialists and trade union leaders. But along with those ideas were ones that refigured Jews as slum dwellers who wallowed in poverty and depended on charity. They were the real outcasts of outcast London. Jews also were thought to be rootless, without loyalties, marginal men, and these figures were primarily male, who tried to be where they did not belong. They were Svengali-like changelings. David suggests that negative stereotypes became refashioned to suit the particular times in which they applied. In World War II, Jews were condemned for being selfish and cowardly, along with unabashedly displaying their wealth, and of course they were the black marketeers. This was during a time when to be truly British was to be unselfish, patriotic, and above all, responsible citizens. Clearly, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and anti-alien sentiments have been articulated and re-articulated throughout the history of early modern and modern Britain. Each time there is a new articulation, the terms of the discourse change as they become interlaced with and modified by new cultural themes and concerns. Commentary by Jewish intellectuals on seeking a homeland in Palestine or elsewhere for the Jewish nation in some ways reflected and reinforced the growing sentiment that Jews did not belong in Britain. David suggests some of the anxieties that were interwoven with anti-alienism, and I want to underscore them here. In the Fin de Siècle, there were widespread and amorphous fears of degeneration and national decline. Anxieties about degeneration were prevalent across Europe. Interestingly, one of the most influential books on the topic was Max Nordau's Degeneration. The title is Degeneration, written in German but translated and widely read in both France and Britain. Nordau, himself a Jew who became a Zionist, saw degeneration as both cultural and national. In Britain, concerns abounded about moral, cultural, physical, and social degeneration. During and after the Boer War, the government focused heavily on the poor physique and medical fitness of boys and men they attempted to recruit into the army. An interdepartmental committee on physical deterioration was convened in 1903 to determine why so many army recruits were rejected. Although the findings indicated there was no evidence of actual long-term physical deterioration in the population, concerns about deterioration and degeneration, and especially their links to poverty and urban life, continued to inform popular culture. Testimony by military officers maintained that the British Army recruits in the South African War made poor fighting men. The outpouring of books and other literature on city life as a main cause of degeneration furthered anxieties about moral and cultural decay, exemplified by London's East End. Arnold White, as well as others, figure in here. White decried both the emigration of, quote, British bone and sinew from rural districts, close quote, and the entry of decadent foreigners into the city. David mentions the writings of George Sims on the urban underclass and Andrew Mearns, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, on outcast London, and argues that, quote, both writers saw urban destitution as a breeding ground for socialism and communism, moral degradation shaded into political chaos, close quote. Glover elaborates further by saying that the final report on the Commission on Alien Immigration, quote, can be read as an attempt to fix upon one particular narrative of the causes of cultural and economic impoverishment in which race and degeneration went hand in hand, close quote. As Daniel Pick has argued in his book, Faces of Degeneration, the Commission and the act itself, quote, should not be seen as a mere anomaly, nor exclusively as some part of some centuries-old phenomenon of anti-Semitism, but in relation to that wider contemporary attempt to construct a racial imperial identity, excluding all bad blood and pathological elements, literally expelling anarchists, criminals, prostitutes, the diseased, and the hopelessly poor, all those now declared undesirable aliens, close quote. That was Pick. I have been underlining the importance of seeing the Aliens Act of 1905, and one might include here the debates about its enforcement in its aftermath, in the context of a discourse of degeneration that was associated with ideas about urban life and poverty, as well as race and anti-Jewish sentiment. But there was also a related anxiety that was a common topic of commentary in the late Victorian and Edwardian period, that of national decline. David touches upon this this fear in his afterword, where he discusses novels such as James Blythe's Ichabod and other stories playing on the dread of invasion. The idea of national decline in this period was linked to the perceived growth of German industrial and military prowess and fears that Britain was in decline as a world power. National decline was linked to another iteration of degeneration anxiety, the idea that Britain had to increase its national efficiency by undertaking a variety of measures to improve its workforce and its military. It was in this context that a host of voluntary organizations promoted patriotism and nationalism, reform of the Navy, militarism, and physical fitness. The manliness of the nation was believed to be under threat as city life was blamed for moral and physical degeneration. Popular literature depicted city boys as neurotic, dyspeptic, pale, and physically fragile. The new imperialism of the fin de siècle was seen by some as an antidote to masculine degeneration, and so social Darwinist thinking led some to see imperial competition as a way to create a society of virile men. Was it such thinking about masculine degeneration that fed into representations of Jewish men as the alien figure, a figure who further threatened the manliness of the nation? Was it this culture of anxiety about masculinity, one enhanced by the concurrent growth of the suffrage movement, that led contributors to the debate about aliens to focus their attentions on Jewish men, both the wealthy and over-civilized Jewish men, as well as the physically and emotionally weak East Ender? As I hinted at earlier, I noticed that the focus in the literature David analyzes primarily depicts the depravity of the Jewish man. From my readings of his readings, Jewess was less often depicted in the as an object of anti-Semitic derision. Here I'm questioning whether gender, especially issues around masculinity, also fed into the cultural climate about debates over alien exclusion. One might argue that this stress on a virile national identity and patriotism, accompanied by fear of decline and degeneration, provided a fertile milieu for the development of a political culture bent on reinforcing the boundaries of the we, of the nation. Freud's concept of the narcissism of minor differences and his argument that hostility to outsiders is a way of facilitating solidarity within the community, mentioned by David in his book, are relevant here. I'm expanding on David's argument by suggesting that the culture of anti-alien, anti-Semitic sentiment emerged within a particular complex conjuncture that led to immigration being defined as a social problem, one that threatened the national we, making state intervention necessary. Narratives of decline, degeneration, and the need for national efficiency made up a complex culture in which literature, as well as popular entertainments and the diatribes of journalists such as Arnold White and Leo Maxey, both reflected and contributed to, and sometimes magnified, exclusionary sentiment. This leads me briefly to take up what I see as the connection between literature and history, and here I'm way out of my depth. Trained as a sociologist, wiggled my way into history, literature, well, okay. So this leads me, anyway, fiction, I would wager, picks up on, engages with, and contributes to the shaping of dominant and subordinate popular sentiments and concerns. But as David's analyses of literature in his book suggest, the narratives are not necessarily telling a single, uncomplicated story. They are rife with contradiction and complexity. This means that readers may interpret them in different ways, but their interpretations, their readings, are a product of their social location, and during times of public anxiety over a social problem, undoubtedly, their readings are shaped by such anxieties.
Thank you. The book opens with a dedication to the memory of two people, one of whom is named as Loretta Loach, who some of us in this room knew, and I think we should remember her tonight. Now, David's is a magnificent book, and I'm very grateful indeed to be here to discuss it. And I'm grateful to the other David for inviting me, and it's also great to be teamed up with Sonia again. I mean, it is a relatively slim book, admirably slim, if I may say, but it is packed with ideas and thought and information. And there is so much to say about it, and I do urge people who are interested to read it, because whatever we say here tonight won't capture the complexity of the book. I've decided to just comment on 4 different aspects of the book, some of which have been rehearsed already. The emergence of the figure of the undesirable alien, the role of imaginative literature in David Glover's interpretation of the act, or the coming of the act, the place of the state in this larger history, and then finally the question of liberal England and the fact or not of its death. What happens to liberalism? Now, these are arbitrary, or if it weren't for David, they'd seem arbitrary, and I'll hope to show that, with luck, that they aren't arbitrary. So let's begin with the undesirable alien and its various cognates. We have the destitute alien, the alien sweater, i.e. someone who works in a sweatshop, with rather more precision, the alien anarchist, and underwriting all these usages, we have the Jew and its derivative of the impoverished Jew. Now, these terms arose in their modern meanings from the intensification of global migration, which can be dated from the 1870s, and the steamship was an important element in this. Across the world, particularly where white settlers had access to the state, restrictions and embargoes on who could go where increased, where people could travel, and certainly where people could settle. And these restrictions were based on the putative imperatives of racial classification. Outside Europe, the principal fear of white settlers turned on the Chinese, on the Yellow Peril, while in Britain the anxieties concentrated and were articulated by the idea of the Jew, or the destitute Jew. And here, as David Glover shows, 2 discursive currents converge. It was early in the 1880s that the term anti-Semitism, or anti-Semite, entered the English language. Originally signifying a peculiarly continental, German or Eastern European, distemper. Second, the notion of the alien itself came to be transported from its customary meanings, derived from the practices and traditions of English common law, and accreted a new set of racial national associations. And I think David describes how these 2 different discursive transformations meet. And in consequence, the figure of the Jew evolved into the idea of what David calls the quintessential foreigner, the quintessential foreigner. Now, this marked a complex discursive transformation over many years, and David tracks these with great skill. Part of the process by which this transformation took place within language was the appearance of new specialist knowledges, which were first deployed and then mobilized to give substance and credibility to the naming of new social figures. And the upshot of this was that the alien becomes the destitute Jew. So distinct from the shifting constellations of popular anti-immigrant sentiment on the ground, like the British Brothers League, there developed socially recognised experts in the field. There are various esteemed public or political figures who travelled to Eastern Europe to investigate the problem firsthand. There are the new public functionaries who David mentioned, the immigration officers who had to make the provisions of the Act work, how immigrants were to be classified. There were civil servants and social investigators associated with the Labour Department of the Board of Trade. There were churchmen and educators, and bringing their own particular investments into trying to work out the enigma of the alien were the group associated with the medical journal Lancet, a crucial intellectual organiser of the age. Now, in terms of the conventional historiography, we're now familiar with the shifting contours of the late Victorian social landscape. We see the emergence of an entire new population of dysfunctional social figures. The contagious prostitute, the homosexual man, the unfit mother, the incorrigible loafer, the hooligan, and they just go on. In this constellation, the undesirable alien played a decisive part, travelling from afar and infiltrating the nation with all manner of contagions. And quite properly, David suggests or implies that the role of the figure of the alien Jew becomes a critical way in which all these other dysfunctional recidivist characters can be understood. Now, as he's indicated, and as Sonia's also mentioned, in tracking these profound discursive transformations, these symbolic transformations, he has much to say about the social function of literature. And he argues that part of the social function of literature was to give narrative form to what were initially manifestations of an inchoate sensibility. And this is my second point about the role of literature. Hopefully they'll come together at the end. Now, as David said, his study opens with Daniel Deronda. Do people know Daniel Deronda? People read it? Yeah? A few murmurs. It is an awkward book, I think. Or rather, he doesn't talk about Daniel Deronda as such, but about the competing ways it was read from 1876, when it's first published, up until the First World War. He talks about its long and active afterlife. He argues persuasively for its massive popularity. There were children's editions and so forth. But most of all, David's argument is that in this attempt to translate messianic Jewish theology into the idioms of the liberal English imagination, a bit which remained necessarily kind of incomplete and unstable, Daniel Deronda detonated ways of thinking about Judaism in late Victorian Britain, which placed the Jew in the centre of things. Or rather, to be more concrete about that, it placed the Jew in the centre of things English. The consequence of this were, perhaps like the novel itself, predictably contradictory. And David goes on to suggest that the mentalities which underwrote the 1905 Act itself repudiated the philosophical conditions which had inspired George Eliot to write Daniel Deronda. Now, much of the book serves to chart the unhinging of George Eliot's liberal, cosmopolitan sense of the world. This is tracked in the emergent world of the state and private expertise, as I've suggested, but also in the domain of imaginative literature. There are some wonderful sections on popular fiction and on popular theatre, particularly melodrama, which I can't follow in detail here. The reader encounters a galaxy of authors. Some are well known, Kipling, Conrad, some I'd never heard of before. And as one reads the book, one can feel and read these accounts of literary intervention, one can feel the dispositions of power turning. And in his afterword, David Glover concludes with a chilling phrase that in the fiction of Saki and in the fiction of James Blythe, who Sonia referred to, readers can witness the entry, quote, of the pogrom into the heart of the English imagination. Now this interpretation, David's interpretation, attests to the profound significance of print culture in the making of those symbolic systems out of which evolved the spectrum of the recidivist social beings who were seen to be poisoning the body politic. The line dividing factual, investigative writing from imagined fiction, even in the generic form of melodrama, was insubstantial, to say the least. Indeed, the power of certain fictions to inform the domain of politics, or to put this more concretely, to shape particular practices of the state, was pronounced. Many of you will know Benedict Anderson's little book on nationalism, celebrated book. In that book, he argues that in the modern period, fictions incrementally seep into the real, seep into history. Fictions seep into history. And it seems to me that the prominence which David gives to imaginative literature in his analysis follows that of Benedict Anderson, arguing that the mentalities which first become visible in imaginative literature actually made the 1905 Act possible. So as I see it, the literary emphasis here, or the literary analysis which David provides, is certainly not secondary or inconsequential. It allows us to grasp the concrete, determinate interconnections between the private world of reveries and of the literary imagination and of the public world, or so-called public world, of politics. As David Glover points out, the 1905 Act could not have been passed without the coalescing of anti-immigrant sentiment under the overarching, articulating sign of anti-Semitism. And what he chooses to call the phantasmatic reality of popular anti-Semitism could not be divorced from the sphere of politics and of public policy. And indeed, implicit in David's reading of this is the phantasmatic realities came to constitute and give life to the political realities of the state. Now, this, I think, brings us close to, it brings us close to Antonio Gramsci. I'm sorry to introduce Antonio Gramsci here because he appears to be Michael Gove's favourite theorist. So it's a rather kind of awkward name to invoke. Anyway, notwithstanding Michael Gove for a second, this brings us close, I think, to Gramsci's conception of the expanded state, in which the institutions of civil society, in this instance the institution of literature, conform what Gramsci was fond of calling the earthworks, which protect the state, complexify the state, and make state practice more than simply the sum of its governing institutions. And actually, Gramsci first theorized the expansive state, thinking about the very period which David Glover is writing about here. Now, to say this is, of course, historically contingent. To say that literature, in some point, becomes in important ways linked into the practice of the state is, of course, contingent. It isn't that always this is the case. It's part of a particular conjuncture which occurs. But that this can happen, that civil society can be mobilized in this way, that literature can be mobilized in this way, I think it's important to say and to recognise. Now this brings me to my final point, which is about the fate of liberal England. Now, David Glover shows here that there did occur a deepening racialisation of conceptions of the world from the time of the publication of Daniel Deronda up until the passing of the 1905 Act. But what can this tell us about the nature of liberal England? And even what can it tell us about the apprehension that at some point, before the First World War, liberal England met its untimely death? Now, much of the debate which is reconstructed in this book, was conducted in precisely these terms of liberal England being in some way irreparably damaged, with those arguing for greater restriction, for greater restrictions on migration, saying this was necessary to preserve English liberties. The opponents of the Acts or the bills are saying that the Acts themselves were dismantling England's freedoms. Now, what you don't get in David's book are large abstractions or dichotomies. And what is admirable about the book is that he resists the temptation to draw out large generalizations from the study of this single act. He shows how the pro and anti-camps were each composed of a complex structure of supporters who shared very few other allegiances. To some potential opponents, the fact that the commitment to asylum was maintained made the act palatable. Asylum itself was a sign of liberality. When the act eventually became operative, it was immediately followed by a massive liberal victory, resulting in administrations which did much to advance progressive causes. Hardly, it would seem, propitious circumstances in which the provisions of the Act could be realised. Now, these complexities suggest to David Glover that the Act itself should be seen as a kind of symptom formation. That the Act itself should be seen as a kind of symptom formation. What he means by that is the drawing together and the combination of contrary elements. What he's saying, in other words, and I find this entirely persuasive, what he's saying is that the liberal and the illiberal were deeply entwined together, and that it's well nigh impossible to put liberal over there and illiberal over there, that they fed off each other and lived together. Now, I'm going to skip it. You've heard it. You've heard it from Sonia and from David. I was just going to say a little bit about the counter-public, the kind of anti-Semitic counter-public which emerges in the lead-up and in the aftermath of the 1905 Act. And this becomes, David suggests, a kind of new feature in English life. And then David Glover says this: anti-Semitism, on page 86 for people who are interested, anti-Semitism belonged to a new moment in national democratic politics, when a new calculus for winning elections and extra parliamentary victories came into being using the emotive and aggressive appeal of racial fantasy. Now, David's emphasis here is on national democratic politics. Now, implicit in this book is the fact that these crucial years of anti-Semitism in Britain coincided with the expansion of the electorate and the coming of the institutions of mass democracy. Now, in the conventions of the national story, the Whiggish story, this coming of democracy marks another instalment in the evolution of national freedom, as indeed it should. But while this is true, it is only partially true. The relationship between mass democracy and anti-Semitism was not contingent. Mass democracy gave form to versions of anti-Semitism. Indeed, the invention of the various recidivist social figures I've talked about, the contagious prostitute and so on, and indeed the alien Jew, and the consequent proliferation of discourses around these figures, provided one of the means, in the conditions of political universalism, to separate the good citizen from those who are deemed the uncitizens. Not the bad citizens, but the uncitizens. It made it possible to distinguish between the fit and the infit, and the unfit, and the healthy and the contagious. And what David Glover seems to me to be arguing is that in this, the historical arrival of the Jew as the undesirable alien played an active part in the strange story of British liberalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. We have, I suppose, just under half an hour left. What I propose is that we actually gather up a set of questions or comments from people and ask Bill and David and Sonia to respond, and then gather up more after that. So if you do have anything to ask or to say, you should throw your hand in the air. Yes, sir.
A comment here. In Austria, about the same period, there was the Karl Lueger situation, and he favored anti-Semitism as a military weapon. And at the time, many of the artisans and some of them were being unsettled by the industrialization and that heavy insecurity. This one with the same effect also applied in this country.
Thank you very much. And there's someone. Yes.
Question about the sort of historical contingency. Essentially, I'll be in favour of the Jew as a negative outside of the came to be at this point. Was correct. And gave rise to sort of intertwined with liberal rights movements. What came before? Because there are third times in history preceding that, figures of outsiders. So was there something immediately before the sort of figures supplanted, or was there something new that was important to say something like that? Sorry if that wasn't very good.
Thank you very much.
I would follow actually, David.
Okay.
I was thinking exactly that why was there not an equivalent term to anti-Semitism developed earlier in relation to the Irish? I was also thinking how gender and the Irish come together in complicating, which I'm sure is the appropriate thing to be doing, the question even of inferiority and national efficiency, when you get people writing in some perplexity about how deficiency in mothering means that not enough mothers breastfeed their children, while at the same time it's quite clear that Irish mothers and Jewish mothers do breastfeed their children and have a lower infant death rate as a result. And this is being discovered by the same people who are identifying the Jews, the Irish as well, even though they didn't seem to get counted as aliens in the legislation. They are there in a lot of the hostile ideology, but that contradiction isn't usually noticed.
Did you want to
It was
say something
basically
on
an
the same
Irish
point, Becky?
thing, so...
Okay. I'll just take one more from up there, and then we'll ask people to respond, and then we'll gather.
Clarify one thing.
particularly George Eliot, the whole idea that new kind of reformation, and that the second coming, and Christianity played a very significant role, and she actually attended several meetings, and that was a prime focus of George Eliot's writing for that as well. And I want to know another thing. Again, Irish, because Victoria herself was extremely anti-Irish. Those cartoons portraying the Irish as monkeys and human beings, all these things going on. And we know that, particularly the role of Oliver Cromwell, took 1848 about 1648, beg your pardon, 1,000 Irish slaves to Montserrat, slaves, and they were 14 to 15 years old age, kids, men. And the last thing, Alien Act, 1905, the sub-clause of Alien Act still exists in the statutory book. So any aliens, so-called, if they play any active role in politics, they can be deported. That exists in law in this country till now. But the Christianity played a very significant role, particularly at George Eliot's time. I just wanted to tell you about that and why, like other already questions raised, Irish were not treated. Ben Tillett, a Labour, collected 80,000 signatures against Alien Act, stopping the Jews to come in. All these things. In early 19th century, the Siemens Union actually said that Chinese coming here should be thrown in the sea.
I think in the early 20th century they tried to stop Chinese immigration, but
those things are going on.
okay, thank you very much. Do you want to respond to any of that, David?
Yeah, sure, I agree. Just taking some of the different points that have made about Irishness, I mean, I do agree that is a precursor of some of the racist agitation that I discuss in the book. So in terms of racial ideology, I mean, I think that's quite clear, but I think it might be worth adding that the ways in which the Irish are understood moves across and into different sorts of racial classifications. So, the obvious example is Carlyle's white Negro. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the way in which particular strands in racial ideologies are kind of gathered up from earlier moments and transformed. So one of the interesting things to go back to something that Bill said about the role of anti-Chinese rhetoric and anti-Chinese policies in the colonies, but also in the 1906 election, is that the issue that crystallizes that is the importation of Chinese labour under special terms into South Africa. And it's a big issue for the Liberals. They're able to make massive capital out of it. But two things happen at the same time. So I suppose it's another example of the complexity that both Sonia and Bill have been talking about throughout, really. And that is that on the one hand, what's happening to the Chinese is being fought and deplored and demonstrated against because it's seen as the reintroduction of a form of slavery which has been outlined. That's the kind of nonconformist rhetoric that's used in the big demonstration around that issue in the pre-election period. But at the same time, of course, you're getting handbills and different forms of writing that mobilise savage stereotypes of the Chinese. So it's both an appeal to an anti-slavery struggle, but at the same time it also uses the danger that the Chinese represent. That they've not only been moved under these sort of terrible conditions, but it's also something to do with the kinds of people that they are, and maybe something to add to that is that there's I don't think I talk about it much in this book, but I've written about it elsewhere. There's a great essay written by Herbert Samuel, who becomes the Home Secretary, on immigration. I think it's in the Economic Journal, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. And if you read it, a lot of it just reads like something that you could read today about globalization, the kind of expansiveness, the wonderful way in which people move across the globe, and different settlements occur and different interminglings between different groupings happen. But of course there's a 0 point beyond which you can't go, and there are lots of examples of successes. So it turns out the Jews in the East End, not surprisingly in this story, turn out to be a sort of good example, a progressive example of the results of this movement. But the Chinese, the people that can never be part of another sort of state or culture than their own. And I think I think it's a great pity that we still don't have actually a good historical account of the role of the Chinese question within the 1906 election. As far as I know, there's lots of good stuff on South Africa, but the material on the UK is very thin.
And although there's a new book, a fairly new book by Sasha Auerbach on the Chinese in Britain. Sonia.
Let me think. I think what I was trying to point out was that the conjuncture in which this act came about included large numbers of people from Eastern Europe fleeing and coming into the country. But it took place, that massive immigration took place, well, it wasn't that massive compared to the numbers that went to the States, but it doesn't matter. It was within the context of the UK. It was a big deal, but it took place in an era when there were many other anxieties present. So what I was trying to argue was that these larger social anxieties got bound up with the threat of the immigrant. And it's under those conditions, when there is this rising diffuse anxiety, and this, we're always anxious, I suppose, but some periods are more, definitely always anxious, but some periods are more anxiety producing than others, and there are the variations. And it's when we have those particular moments that we get these arguments about the other that become center stage. They become center stage. They become, and this is not to deny that there hasn't been prejudice against the Irish for, hundreds of years.
Ancient history.
Pardon?
Kind of ancient histories was it a big, so I was kind of thinking in terms of Greeks, Romans, barbarians.
Right, well, that's right. Your story, you can do that. You can look, lots of outsiders. There have always been lots of people who have been defined as outsiders. But those become problems under certain circumstances.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to argue. And that what David has done is to show how the literature of the period was contributing to and elaborating on these anxieties focused around the immigrant Jew.
Thanks. Bill?
I have one
I'll
other
just,
thing.
I'll just make a very quick point about the historiography. It's very interesting that a range of immediate questions which come about a comparative analysis, asking, well, what was happening to the we heard about the Jews, what was happening to the Irish and Chinese and so on. Of course, but we can't. These are still relatively new questions. We can't we can't do the comparative analyses until we have the particular analyses. I don't know how long ago you started this book, but it was a while ago. They just take a long time. We can see now what's obvious now. It kind of wasn't obvious 10 years ago, maybe, or 20 years ago, where we have to try and think how the idea of the Chinese articulated to the Irish and how they shift and so on. That work needs to be done, but that can't be done until we have more books like David's, which kind of tells the story, the specific instances.
Although I'll abuse my position as a point.
Abuse yourself.
In public. I think that problem that you're talking about also indicates a methodological problem, because some of what is in David's book and the sort of approach that Sonia was taking is about how in this case, the alien or the Jew as the other reveals something about English or British anxieties. But what that approach struggles to show are the specific functions of different others. It's extremely good at saying something about English or British society. It's not so strong as an approach to explaining why stereotypes of the Chinese take certain persistent forms, stereotypes of the Irish take certain persistent forms, and the Jews take other different
Could I
forms.
just raise another methodological issue, because I realise I didn't answer the question that gentleman 4 rows back raised about Austria. And another problem I think that makes these comparisons difficult, and I think it comes out very strongly in the Chinese example, is that you're talking about the mobility of ideas, the way in which they move across different contexts. And I'm not sure I'm really I can give you the answer that you need to the question that you asked. But I think what is maybe worth saying as a sort of partial answer is that, as I think Bill said, anti-Semitism, we can date when it really sort of enters the English language. And essentially, it's coming from anti-Semitismus. It's coming from Germany, and one of the early political anti-Semites comes on what he hopes is a speaking tour of England, and of course the people that know that he's coming, who are German refugees or German settlers of one kind or another, are precisely the people that don't want to hear him speak, and so the visit, shuts down very, very quickly, and as a speaking tour, it doesn't really happen. Now, this happens quite early on, but it's an interesting example, because although it is very, very specific, what it's suggesting is that the initial uses of the term came with very sort of negative connotations.
It makes up yesterday's letter, the otherness. I remember during the war, there was anti-American feeling. They're overpaid, oversexed, and over here.
Yes. David?
Thanks very much for a fascinating panel. I guess it's the lawyer in me that is quite interested between the tension between alien as a generic term and the Jew. And of course, all of this kicks off after Anglo Jewry, anyway, has been emancipated. They're given rights, they're citizens. And I'm wondering, and the concept of alien, which I didn't know, I didn't realise was a common law concept. And it strikes me, and I think this maybe goes to the point about mass democracy. On the one hand, you have no way of discriminating anymore between people who are in the country. So what you have to do, as opposed to this concept of alien that, as we've discussed today, many people fall under, what happens, because democracy doesn't allow distinctions, we're all the same formally, you then have to make stuff up about the character that discriminates between, I think someone said, the good citizen and the bad citizen. So in fact, the irony is that the Jew is the content of the concept of alien, as far as I'm thinking it through. Once citizenship and emancipation becomes uniform, all the boundaries that used to separate breaks down, and that leads to this very strange internalizing of separating the Irish from the Chinese from the Jew, each with their special characteristics that overlap. It's just
thank you. I'd like to take, I'm sure, 3 extremely brief comments to squeeze them in. Yes, sir.
I was picking up on what Sonia mentioned about anarchism, and I wondered if there was a sense of which the Jew is a political revolutionary at a time when there are questions about the emergence of the Labour Party into the House of Parliament, so the Labour Party setting itself as a mainstream democratic organisation, and whether or not the Aliens Act is also a fear of revolutionary European politics entering into the British body politic.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to go back to the Irish. I think it follows on from the point that you've just made. I'm thinking the way in which, the Aliens Act, it doesn't actually solve the problem. If we sort of look in the interwar period, actually a lot of if you look at the function of the Irish there, we can't keep the Irish out because they're still British subjects, but actually they're the ones who are very often in the poor law cases, and in terms of control of typhus, for example, they're the people who are being picked up as being the undesirable ones, and nothing can be done about them because they're British subjects and not aliens. And so it, in a sense, this sort of, I think, carries the argument on that actually what is being picked up and what the Aliens Act is doing, it's around the sort of the cultural fear rather than actually what the practical problem might be.
Did you have a question?
Just as, may I just ask the panel, just as current scholars accuse or certainly imply that the majority of the German populace was probably aware of the policies taken at the top, do you think that the majority of the English were also aware or indeed condoned the positioning of the other as it led to the Alien Act?
Thank you very much. I'll just ask, I think I'll ask Bill and Sonia to respond, and then David. I think it's appropriate if David has the last word. Bill.
Blimey.
Go on, man.
I'd like just to make a comment, not respond to the first question, from the legal mind we have at the back there. I mean, I think it is a real problem, and I was aware of this when I was speaking about how we conceptualise the non-citizens or bad citizens or uncitizens. And what you said when you were talking, and I could hear myself saying the same kind of thing, is what you have to have, when the universal democracy comes, what you have to have is this, that there have to be these mechanisms in order to be able to distinguish, the bad or uncitizens from the citizens. But that is a kind of quite functionalist way of posing the problem. So I think we have to find a way of stepping back from that, and in a sense just trying to describe what happens rather than seeing some mechanism within democracy itself which kind of generates this, automatically generates all these other non-citizens or bad citizens. But I'm sympathetic to your question, absolutely so. That's all.
Thank you, Bill. Sonia.
First of all, I think that if someone could find me a society in which there were no internal others, that is, people who were singled out for and classified as unworthy, I would love to find it. My guess is that that part of the definition of particularly under of a community or a nation is the defining of who the we are, and that always means a kind of identifying of a non-we. So I think this is is this overgeneralizing, or it probably is overgeneralizing, but it seems to me that it is part of the fabric of social life. Why do, I can't remember if it was David, I think it was David in response to the Irish-Chinese issues, said why do these stereotypes take specific forms when they do? I think one of the things that happens is that those forms go back a long way. That is, there are stereotypes that get retold and retold through narratives, through literature, through common everyday discourse. They get changed as they move along, but they are retold, so that they get reshaped, but they're attached already. They're already attached. Mm-hmm. I mean, the figure of the Jew as the moneylender, right, is a pretty old one. The conniving, money-grabbing person is a kind of old one, and it gets used by the socialists now because they're looked on as the dirty capitalists. I'm wondering, never mind. And as far as as far as good and bad citizenship is concerned, one of the things that I wondered about, which we haven't talked about, is the rise of new liberalism in this period, which is a new liberalism, which places, and we talked about it a little bit when Bill mentioned the reforms that the Liberal Party began to put in. New liberalism had the state playing a much larger role in helping the people because they conceptualized the common good. So once you have the common good and the good citizen, that again is putting boundaries around who the we are. Who's worthy of getting this help? Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly on the last 3 points that have been made. On the relationship between the alien and the Jew and other categories of otherness, one point that I would want to make, I mean, you may be right that this historical moment and the new deployment of the term does actually, begin to set in motion different uses of these categories. But one thing that I think is important is that I think the alien, for the first time, I think Bill's right that it's moving from a sort of common law meaning, which is to do with one's relationship to a monarch, and its object, its corollary is subject. It's not citizen. So it's very interesting when citizen increasingly starts to become part of the set of ideas to think with when one's considering what the state would be. But that, I mean, of course, that alien subject dichotomy lasts for a long time. It doesn't really start to go away, despite the fact that lots of people are talking about citizens and writing, very, very well thought out and very considered and learned arguments about citizens. It doesn't really come into existence until the late 1940s, really. And then that's the beginning, I think, of a sort of new phase in which citizen can begin to replace the notion of the subject. But it's interesting. I don't know if you read the announcement, the period of the announcement of Mark Carney taking over in the Treasury, in the Parliament. George Osborne, but it had been said before. He said, of course, he's a British subject too. That really matters, So that language is that's not gone away, It may be sort of covered over with the language of citizenship, but it's tempting to think that the language of citizenship is actually still relatively shallow, and one could argue, it's kind of constantly being eroded by the form that the state's increasingly taking. About the Jew as political revolutionary, yes, I think that's absolutely right. Funnily enough, I think it becomes more important in the period after the Act than before, partly because people are moving away from Eastern Europe in greater numbers after 1905, because the Liberal government thinks that what you have here is a sort of real refugee situation, and you need to operate the Act with a light touch. And of course that outrages all of the people on the radical right that wanted the thing in the first place. And not surprisingly, that whole decade, half decade really, is a period where I can't prove this in the way that I'd really like to, but I think the mood is one of betrayal, really. That the Act is the sort of symbol of all of the things that the people have been betrayed on, and that's the sort of subject of the book called Ichabod, the novel that Sonia referred to. And yes, that does lead into things like the Tottenham outrage and the siege of Sydney Street, and those are sort of seen as kind of proto-revolutionary acts, but I actually think as episodes they're sort of fairly murky in terms of who did what and so on. But yes, that does become I think very important. On general knowledge, just one last point: who knows what, and how kind of thoroughgoing some of these concepts and ideas are across the social structure generally. It's perfectly true that I have what's the longest chapter in the book is the one that's about the counterpublic of anti-Semitism, as I call it there. And yes, I do look at the sorts of resources that are available for politicians and propagandists and those who raise their business. But the cautionary note that, and I think those things are very sort of difficult to map. I think if you're talking about something like anti-Semitism, so the moment where I'll be a sociologist again, I think the sort of concept you need is the concept of a field. You need to be able to sort of map different positions and how they sort of interact, and I think it's one of the sort of few useful concepts in recent years personally. But just going on from that, I also think that if you look very closely, and they're things that are very hard to find, what you also notice are kind of moments where the play with the stereotype or whatever what representation, whatever it happens to be, doesn't quite fit. So when you read Margaret Harkness and she talks about the music halls and people waving their handkerchiefs and the patriotic spectacles, and it's as if that's all that needs to happen for people to be in the old language interpolated, and that's it. They're done for. Reading some of and they're kind of hard to find, and they're hard to sort of pick up on. But what you find are accounts of reporters or reviewers going along, and they write their sort of slightly ironic account for the Times or whatever it happens to be. But there's something that's disturbing them, and that is that the audience, the working class audience that's going out, and they're going out for a good time, are not being sort of swamped by this by these kind of representations. They're also taking the piss. They're having a good night out. They've probably been drinking, and the reviewers sort of saying, well, why would they do that? Doesn't that destroy the point of the theatre? But it's as anybody been to stand up knows, it's a sort of continued the sort of struggle between the performer and the audience is what those kind of popular events are really all about. So I think we have to kind of attend to those kind of things as well. And I think probably the person that has done has looked at that and developed ways of thinking about it more thoroughly, I would say would be somebody like Peter Bailey, you know, who's a kind of fabulous writer on popular culture, and one should return to him, you know, not take these things initially quite as straight as they perhaps sometimes appear to be.
Well, it's extremely generous of you to end on a recommendation to someone else's work, but I think the sort of overall message of tonight is to read David Glover's work. Without wanting to inhabit a stereotype, I will say that if you want to read it at 20% discount, please take a flyer from the front, and that privilege will be yours. But before you go, I hope you'll join me in thanking David and Sonia and Bill for a really, I think, for an evening of really extremely high quality exchange and discussion. And thank you all too. Thank you very much.